I feel quite passionate about. It's ultimately something that I hope will assist both your own businesses and your client's business, and hopefully actually encourage the appropriate conversations with your clients to challenge them. I am firmly of the view that the advisor's role is changing, and we're changing from very much a compliance culture to the position where clients are expecting a trusted advisor. And as I said, I'm really using this as a piece to try and help your conversations with your clients. And I think, well, in fact, I hope what will come out of this afternoon's presentation is that success of a business is far more than just the numbers. We also need conversations about long-term sustainability. There are definitely a number of elements that are important in a business, and they need to actually coexist to have a successful business. Believe it or not, for us, it's rare to find the cause of failure is of just the owners not managing the finances for an established business. It's far more common that there are non-financial issues that actually put pressure on the finances. You could contrast a new business with that, because often new business that will be the cause of failure could in fact be just the financial issues. So moving on, I wanted to talk about business failure. I'm not just talking about liquidation or bankruptcy. The number of businesses that are failing in Australia is staggering. Only a small portion of those go into external administration, and I'm talking something like 20%. I want to talk today about businesses that are not achieving what they set out to achieve. They've closed their doors, they've depleted all the money they have, or the business is no longer viable. Perhaps the competitors have got the upper hand. And it's, I think, an opportune time in the Australian economic cycle to talk about business failures. Certainly, if you have a look at even the NABS data that came out yesterday and today on business confidence, it's very low. And you look around, certainly if you look in Melbourne at prime retail strips, and I'm talking Bridge Road, Glenferrie Road, Toorak Road, there's a myriad of for lease signs. And certainly retail, I think, is suffering particularly badly. So I'm going to focus on the SMEs because the SMEs, if you look at it, according to the ABS data, SMEs comprise 97% of all businesses in Australia. So that's a business that actually employs less than 20 staff. Therefore, I would imagine that most of us deal with small businesses. So I guess with that background, it's interesting to note that small businesses are actually shutting their doors in alarmingly high numbers. Last year, and this is the last set of business failure data, almost 55,000 businesses failed. That's a staggering number. I'm sure you'll agree with me. The majority of these were in the SME space, and it was a 12.7% increase on the year before. Believe it or not, and I'm sure you will believe it, retail is the front runner. Retail is actually 1.5 times higher than the all sectors average. So really, I suppose that deals with the past. The failures are up. What does the future look like? And there was a survey that was done by Amex in late 2018. They surveyed 1,000 small business operators, and they found that a third had moderate to high risk of insolvency in the next 3 to 5 years. 1/3 of those surveyed said they had moderate to high risk of insolvency in the next 3 to 5 years. That's staggering data. And when you break that down, fashion, 43% said they had moderate to high risk of insolvency in the next 3 to 5 years, and food retailers was even higher at 53%. So basically, in those two industries, 1 in 2 of those data, in food and retail are likely to fail in the next 3 to 5 years. And when you look at it, the survey seems to actually match the real data. 60% of more small businesses cease in the first 3 years. So that's the background. It's not an inspiring picture, particularly if you or one of your clients was thinking about starting a small business tomorrow. you might want to rethink that. But really what I want to talk about today is how to avoid being one of those statistics, and what you need to do to make sure you're not going to fail. So I'm going to exclude for today's presentation the businesses that I would say are destined to fail. I'm going to exclude those. They're either a bad idea, they were never going to work. We've all seen them. You've all seen clients come in, they're so excited about their new business venture, or they're so excited about being a director of a company, being able to be called a director of a company. How exciting is that? I've just finished the AICD course on company directorship. If you ever want a reason not to become a director, go and sit through the first 2 days of that course, because they'll give you every reason why you shouldn't be a director. Now, I do want to just reflect on a couple of businesses that were never going to work. The first one, the dog PC. Now, I'm a dog lover, and I do spend significant amounts of money on my dog, including probably taking her to the ophthalmologist this afternoon. But ultimately, the dog PC. Now, as you can see from the caption, helping every dog achieve their dream. Now, I understand that this allows the dog to play games and the ability to FaceTime the owner. My dog would love that, but ultimately, was that business ever going to work? I don't think so. Next one was a Tinder-like app for those flying solo, to connect those flying solo with other like-minded travellers. Now, could you imagine going on a 20-odd hour flight to Europe and sitting next to the worst date, the worst date of your life? Yeah, you've got another 20-odd hours to deal with them. So again, something that probably was never going to work. And ultimately, let's just see if I can get the last one that I'll deal with very quickly is the skunk lock, and that's the lock that fights back. It emits a pressurized chemical spray similar to a pepper spray if you tamper with it. You really think that was ever going to work as a business? So whilst it's actually humorous to talk about them, I'm not interested in those businesses that were never going to work or were likely to fail in the first few years for today's presentation. They often share very similar hallmarks. They start with a terrible idea, they have a lack of capital, they run out of money, they lack proper training, and they may get carried away with the romance of owning a business. And I'm sure we've all seen clients who think it's a great idea to be a director of a company, as I said earlier. Just to put some sober statistics, this one is quite frightening, to be honest, because I don't think often that new owners appreciate the effort that's required to run a small business. Not easy, can be quite stressful, and not only do business owners put stress on themselves, they also often put stress on the families. Now, these statistics that I've got up on the screen now were taken from the IPA statistics from their white paper, which was done last year, where the IPA conducted research into small businesses, and it goes to show the mental health of many small business owners and the role the advisor plays. Believe it or not, of those surveyed, 70% of small business owners claim to be stressed, anxious, or depressed. It's not a great statistic, is it? I probably should have given you a disclaimer up front and said that ultimately, if you were thinking about starting a small business, I'm probably not going to inspire you to do it. The good news is that 95% of those that were surveyed reported engaging with their public accountant to reduce their stress, anxiety, or depression. So they're passing it on to advisors like you and me. And I think on a serious note, that actually goes to show the changing role of an advisor that I alluded to earlier. So my view is we not only need to educate prospective business owners about the risks and realities of new business, but equally important, if not more so, is to challenge those who've been in business for some time. And today I'm talking about businesses that got through the initial challenges that have hit a roadblock some years down the track. I'm going to point out a few things to watch for. Why have we selected 10 years? There's no science, but most people regard 10 years as a mature business. It's usually built up some value, has some loyal customers, potentially saleable, and also makes a profit for its owners. And believe it or not, new business today statistically have less than a 30% chance of being around in 10 years' time. So the statistics are not with you for starting a small business. So moving along, how do you do it? And I suppose to do that, we probably need to define success. Success, I think if I polled the professional advisors, it's likely to be money or profit. And that's most likely what many advisors might focus on. Getting more work in, upselling services, getting staff to produce more with less, cutting costs, the balance sheet and the profit and loss levers that drive up values and profit. Now, I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that those discussions should actually cease. I think they should continue, and I do think they're important because financial performance is integral to business. However, what I do say is, from my experience, positive financial performance and longevity in business is often simply a byproduct of getting the other things in business right. And for a mature business, as I said earlier, it's actually rare for us to find that its downfall is purely related to not paying attention to its financial position. It's more likely other issues in the business. So let's have a look at what I say makes up a successful business. I've come up with 4 pretty basic quadrants, and I see them as critical to any business. And I often reflect and think 30 years ago, you could actually make money without getting all of these right. Today, if you don't have all of them right, then ultimately, then you're likely to have a problem with your business. Now, I'm going to talk about each one in turn, and that will take up the balance of the presentation today. So the first one, I feel very passionate about, is systems. And I'm not just talking about IT. Believe it or not, I think you can operate without a computer, and I can hear all of you laughing. A friend of mine recently went on a work trip to China. His role was actually to interview a lady that was running a trucking business. Now, I understand that business had about 400 trucks on the road in China, and ultimately did not have a computer in the office. Reality is they were so systemized, they knew what they were doing. It is an extremely successful business. So ultimately, what I say is it's just not IT, but I'm talking about processes, I'm talking about procedures, and I'm talking about generally getting efficiencies in place in relation to your business. And this is as important for our own businesses as it is for our clients. And it's a key issue in mature businesses. If the business then faces expansion or contraction, we actually need systems to efficiently manage the work and the processes to actually adapt to a change in work volume and work mix, and actually to manage risk. It's really important to have good systems in place to manage risk. And I'll tell you a story of a business that ultimately didn't have systems in place. Now, this was a Hire a Hubby franchise, and as you could imagine, fairly simple sort of business, a business that people like me who are no good at anything handy require. The business had done all right over the years. It had been run by the director, and ultimately he did all the quoting, all the invoicing, he was taking all the calls, so he was basically doing everything in the business. Going back to 2012, 2013, ultimately he was making about $100,000. He was happy with that. But the business kept growing. And by 2014, he needed to employ his wife, who started to take the calls, and ultimately, before long, because the phone kept ringing, and that's a problem I'm sure we all wish we had, he had to put on 5 full-time staff plus a bookkeeper, yet the calls kept coming in. company wasn't actually equipped to deal with growth. And believe it or not, he had a policy of never saying no to work. And ultimately what happens, and if you have a look at the financial statements, they show that the financial performance had deteriorated at an increasing rate every year that the business had grown since 2013. And by the time, well, certainly within the last couple of years of the company's life, the company had made substantial losses. And the issue was one of systems and processes. The accountant had said to him, cut costs. The business itself, in peak times, was spending thousands of dollars on some contractors and lots of time fixing up defects. There was effectively a lack of profitability due to inefficiency. So cutting costs in isolation was never going to help him. The business needed to pause and review the way they did their work, because ultimately the operations were a shambles. The work allocation was arbitrary. There was no regard given to the expertise of staff members or the location of the work that was allocated to them. The business owner did all the quoting. To keep control of the business, he thought just doing the quoting was the appropriate way forward for him, which ultimately meant he was completely off the tools. The policy of never saying no to a job added to the rectification costs because he was often doing things beyond his experience. He had no systems in place to send the appropriate employee or subcontractor to a particular job. He would send whoever was available without regard to their skills. The operations were disjointed. There were no KPIs for the staff or accountability amongst the staff. And the paperwork was a complete and utter mess. When you look at it, this business on paper should have been successful, but what they needed was operational advice. And whilst this example stemmed from growth, the issues can occur from not revisiting processes when the business shrinks or when competitors outbid you. It seems to me that businesses are often content to cut costs. They'll change suppliers, they won't give staff pay rises, but they seem reluctant to holistically review the way they actually work. And we often get, after the event, some sage advice from directors, and this director was no different. He gave us his thoughts on what he needed to succeed, and what he told us was he needed 5 carbon copies of himself. And ultimately, that's a common theme. I often hear directors say, well, I just needed copies of myself. I actually don't believe that that's what he needed. He needed to review his internal processes, put proper systems in place, and ultimately, if he had have done that, he didn't need 5 carbon copies of himself, but he needed staff to follow his systems. I don't need to spend a lot of time, I'm sure, telling you about the benefits of systemisation. Ultimately, better customer service, which is the foundation of almost any business, consistency in ensuring things don't slip through the cracks. It gives you more autonomy. The employees will become more engaged. It lets the business owner actually step away and not have all their hard work undone. So the business owner can actually work on the business, not in the business. And ultimately, improved efficiencies lead to a better financial performance. And on this issue, I just wanted to reflect on the difference between top line and bottom line, because often I hear people say, well, if you want to increase your profit, increase your sales. I just wanted to challenge that notion briefly today. This business, I've used the old a third rule of professional services business, because in the olden days, or when I started in the profession, I had a boss that would tell me it's a third for salaries, a third for overheads, and maybe there'll be a third left over for profit. So this could be a professional services business, or could be any business really. It's turning over $5 million with a profit of 1.65 million. And ultimately, we want to increase the bottom line by 15%. Now, one way to do that is to go out and get more sales. Now, if we maintain our margin we'd need another $750,000 worth of sales. Now, I'm not sure about your businesses or your clients' businesses, but for me, finding an extra $750,000 of sales is not an easy task. If any of you know anyone that needs $750,000 worth of bankruptcy or liquidation services, don't hesitate to give them my details. But as you can imagine, it's a bit like the Undertaker waiting for the next bubonic plague. The other way is to achieve efficiency gains and actually reduce your costs by 7.5%. And to me, in our business, that would be the easier way of doing things, actually increasing efficiencies and reducing costs. And I firmly believe that a 7.5% reduction in costs is an easier thing to achieve than a $750,000 increase in the top line. Anyway, I share that as food for thought. This is my favourite slide of the presentation. And if you reflect on the last 20 years, we've had an extremely rapid pace of technology change. Even though I haven't been able to make technology work properly today, I'm not using one of these Smith Corona typewriters. And when you think about it, the benefits that technology can actually bring was probably only about the year 2000 when email first started being used for business. And that's not all that long ago. The iPhone, which gave you the internet on a mobile device, was only about 10 years ago. Now, I think the message of technology is if you shy away from change, you will likely come through our doors. And I guess probably the easiest reflection I have of a business that shied away from change was a tile manufacturer that I did the liquidation of back in 2015. This company had been around for 40 years. I firmly remember meeting the directors for the first time, French couple, and when I met them, they told me a little bit of history. They had sold their investment property a couple of months earlier, and the investment property, the proceeds went into the company, which they subsequently used in trading. The week before I saw them, they'd sold the family home, and the proceeds of the family home were going to go into the company to pay back most of the bank's debt. So pretty sad story. Ultimately, when I spoke to this couple, they told me about a high quality product they were making, and they were complaining about the cheap imports. And they said that that was the catalyst for their business failure. Thing was, I actually got to walk through the factory, and going through the factory was like going through a time walk. It was like going back to the 70s or the 80s. The reality is the business owners had the same setup that was in operation from when they first opened their doors. So the same business processes and plant and equipment had been around for 40 years. And they were actually surprised when some of their competitors were more efficient and were undercutting them. It was a complete surprise. So I think it's just a reminder that we can't shy away from technological changes. And I think there is a lot to be said for the benefits of systemization, and focusing on the systems and the process as a whole is definitely a sure way to ensure the longevity of a business and by extension increase its profitability. So as I said, I feel pretty passionate about systems, and I do, you know, my earliest memory was I was an employee of the business that you'd probably describe as the Golden Arches. And have you ever seen a more systemized business? Every franchisee is given a black book, and it's probably electronic these days, I'm showing my age, but ultimately that black book takes you through everything you need to know to run a franchise effectively. So I'll move on to marketing, which is the second quadrant. Now, the reality is 20 years ago, if you had a well-placed ad in the Yellow Pages as a professional, you were bound to get some good work. Now, what do we do with the yellow pages? I get my local yellow pages, and for years I've been throwing it in the recycle bin when it's delivered. I've actually found a new use for it. I have an aging dog, as I mentioned earlier, and she can't necessarily bend because of the arthritis to get down to her bowl. So I'm actually very proud of the fact that I no longer throw it straight into the recycle bin, but it's actually used as a bowl raiser, so Maggie doesn't have to bend down to get to her water bowl. But I think it goes to show that if you don't keep up with marketing changes, then ultimately your ads could be going straight in the recycle bin. Today, there's so many places you can advertise: LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Google. There's endless places, and I'm not going to focus on the effectiveness of them because frankly, I don't know. But what I do know is marketing is a critical part of any business. And I can't talk about marketing without talking about the power and the importance of the internet, because ultimately we can't hide from it. Whether you use the internet for lead generation or not, it's a powerful marketing tool, and that's whether you use it for advertising or not. And really, when you think about it, if you have a client that you want to send to me or one of the partners at Worrells, and the client does a Google and there are bad reviews of whichever partner it is, then ultimately, is the client going to come and see me? And I would question whether, in fact, the client will come and see me if there are bad reviews. If I'm described online as the world's worst liquidator and no bedside manner, I suspect that it's going to be a harder sell to get the client to come and see me. And after all, we all do Google professionals that we're using. And ultimately, have a look at these statistics. These show that 93% of local consumers use reviews to determine if a local business is good or bad. And 92% of consumers now read online reviews. And that's up from 88% in 2014. So in 4 years, it's gone up 4%. And as you can see, it's quite high. So irrespective of whether you're a liquidator, real estate agent, or restaurateur, it's important to have an understanding of your online space and our online persona. Don't kid yourself that the client won't look. It's the same for potential new staff, that they will be Googling you to see what they can find, and suppliers as well. And I wanted to share a story of the first time that I realised how powerful the internet was from a marketing point of view. And in fact, I'll give you two stories because I also want to talk about social media and the impact that it can have on a business. But ultimately, both of these examples are from businesses that don't earn $1 of their revenue from sales via the internet. First one was a surgeon. Now, this lady came to see me one Friday afternoon. She was referred by her accountant. When she came to see me, she was sporting a bankruptcy petition from the tax office. I often tongue-in-cheek call the tax office the fifth major bank. And there is a reason why I would refer to it like that in this particular case. So this lady, she was very busy, and I tend to find I've done a number of bankruptcies for surgeons over the years, and I tend to find they're very busy people. I think the first surgeon I ever did a bankruptcy for became bankrupt because he didn't open his mail. So he was too busy to open his mail. But this lady, she'd been very busy, and she was so busy, she didn't attend to paying her PI insurance. Now, ultimately, she finished up having 2 malpractice claims. To her credit, she paid both of the damages claims in full. But ultimately called upon the fifth major bank, I mean the ATO, where she wasn't paying her taxes, and ultimately racked up quite a substantial debt with the ATO. She decided that she was going to go bankrupt. She went home over the weekend and filled in a statement of affairs. And I think most of you will have seen a statement of affairs. Ultimately, a statement of affairs is a document that deals with, amongst other things, assets, liabilities, and income. I was reviewing it with her the following week, and I actually got to the section on income. And I said to her, "Doctor, your income looks very low to me for a surgeon." And that was at the point she looked at me and she said, "Paul, you've got to understand, ultimately, had these surgery mishaps happened 10 years ago, the cases would have been in a law book on a barrister's shelf. Now, today, anybody can Google my name and can see these cases and can read these cases. As a result, it has severely hampered my income." And really, in 2019, who doesn't Google their medical practitioner or specialist? It's probably the first thing you're going to do if you're sent to a medical specialist. So as I said, her income had been seriously inhibited, and in fact, it will be inhibited probably for the rest of her life. So the message out of that one to me was the internet has the ability to make or break all of our businesses and all of the businesses of our clients. So you have to be very careful about your online persona. Now, I said I was going to talk about the effect of social media on a company, and this is a matter that we started about 12 months ago, where I do believe social media has actually helped its demise. This business was a large construction business. They didn't pitch for work on the internet at all. The directors had very good relationships. They had a huge string of work, and when we were appointed administrators, there was about $150 million worth of contracts on the go. So getting the work wasn't the problem. But ultimately, they got a little bit of a reputation for stringing out their suppliers and their subcontractors for payment. And the subbies took to social media to voice their concerns and to warn others. And ultimately, what that did, it meant it was so much harder for the business to get subcontractors and also for the business to get supplies because of what was on social media and the internet. They actually preempted the company's insolvency prior to the company's ultimate demise. And I believe that there's no doubt that the online persona of the company exasperated its demise. Because ultimately, if you're a subcontractor, would you work for a business like that? If you weren't guaranteed payment in your ordinary terms, you were told that, you know, it might take 90, 120 days to be paid. And when there is other work around, I think it's more likely that you're likely to go and work for somebody else. So hence the business had real trouble getting subcontractors, getting staff. I did say I thought marketing was really important for any business, and there's just one book that I would touch on. If you're looking for something to read, a book that focuses on what's important in your business and is probably worthwhile for some of your clients to read, is a book called The Purple Cow by Seth Godin. That is probably one of my favourite marketing books. I'll touch on a couple of books as I finish the presentation, just things that I think might be useful and things that I've found useful over the years. Now, moving to the next quadrant, I'll talk about staff and the people issue. For those of us that do employ people, sometimes you think it can be a bit of a challenge. You've got to train them, you've got to motivate them. You've also probably got to listen to their problems. There's going to be sick days, there's going to be performance issues, and of course there's unfair dismissal if we get it all wrong. And finding the right people can seem like it's almost impossible, no matter how much you pay in recruitment fees some days. But it's really interesting to have a look at the 2018 study on the state of the workplace. That study found that 60% of all employees in Australia are not engaged. That is, they lack motivation, they're unlikely to invest discretionary effort in the organisational goals or outcomes. believe it or not, it's not on the slide, but 16% of that 60% are actively disengaged. They're unhappy, they're unproductive, and they're likely to spread negativity about your business, and they're probably working against you. On average, only about 24% are engaged, and above that, 16% are actively engaged. And it's those actively engaged people that we all want in our business, those that want to do the best for the business, those that want to put in the extra effort to help the business reach its goals. But when you look at it, there are ultimately only 16% of those on your payroll that are actively engaged, and conversely 16% of your payroll that are actually working against the business. Now, I did want to move on to an example of a matter I've been involved in over the years. And this is a business that you would think had almost everything right, with the exception of its people. It was a pretty good business on the face of it. Clients, processes, it always had plenty of work, and on the face of it made reasonable margins. It was a large-scale engineering company, was actually respected in the industry for great infrastructure and processes, and ultimately had about 70 staff when we were appointed administrators. And ultimately, I guess to give you a bit of background on this one, the father came to see us, and he had one of those old form director penalty notices. So one of those director penalty notices that gave him 21 days to pay the debt, put the company into administration, or put the company into liquidation. It's probably not going to be a huge surprise to anybody that it was day 20 when he brought it to us. And the penalty notice was for just over $3.5 million. So it was a significant amount of money. Dad, by this stage, was in his 70s, so he wasn't young, and ultimately he had to make a choice, because what he kept saying to us was, there's something not right. You know, I don't believe I owe this to the ATO. I don't believe I owe it. Doesn't add up. Now, ultimately, his choice was put the company into administration or accept liability under that notice and move on. On his analysis, the business was profitable and was doing well. So it made no sense to me as to why he would have such a large tax debt. So ultimately, we were appointed administrators, and we did some investigation. What we found was the company was running two systems, and one system was running payroll, the other system was running the general ledger of the company. So the reason he didn't think he had such a large tax debt was because the PAYG had been never journaled into the general ledger of the company, so it was never showing in the accounts. This hadn't been picked up, and when you have a look at the family tree, can I call it a family tree, the who's who of the company, they were all family. So his daughter-in-law was the head of finance. She had no qualifications at all. She was in charge of the sole accountant. Ultimately, just wasn't the right person for the job because she didn't have any real accounting knowledge at all. And as a result, once we looked at it further, the company had been making quite significant losses for some years, but because the PAYG had never been journaled across into the accounts, no one was aware of it. And you can see from the screen, there are a number of other family members that were involved in the company. And we did some fairly significant investigations into this company. And what we found, which is not something we see often, is that two key employees were in fact actively sabotaging the business. They had set up a business in direct competition to the company. So when this company was tendering for work, they would put in a tender at a lower amount. Alternatively, if there was work floating around that there was no need for a tender for, and they were able to move it across to their other business, that was exactly what they were doing. And when you think about all of this, and I'm just giving you a small snapshot, all of this was stemming from a people problem. We didn't have the right people in the business at all. And the director had given no consideration at all to the people problem. You know, it would be no surprise to any of you, I'm sure, to learn that each of the family members had a company car, a fuel card, an expense account. And we spent literally weeks trying to reconcile the loans that each of the family had taken from the company, because they used the company like their own personal bank. Ultimately, I come back to the two key employees that were actively sabotaging the business, and the employee base generally. And when you think about it, the employees were just not engaged in this business. Ultimately, why would you work there long term when the hierarchy was the family members that you see on the screen? Ultimately, the good people were leaving them very quickly. They weren't staying longer term because they couldn't see a future there, because ultimately they felt that they could never get past the family members that were effectively in management positions in this company. So ultimately, it's a matter of if you have the wrong people, you're likely to have high staff turnover and recruitment costs, average quality of work, lack of consistency, clients who aren't being treated well, and ultimately the risk of losing clients. And you're likely to breed a poor culture in your workplace. You get the right people, the owners have more time, they can actually work on the business instead of in the business. You get better outcomes in relation to products, services, and customer satisfaction. The owners are less stressed, they have the ability to succession plan, they have the ability, they have people that actually want to go the extra mile. In my view, the staff is critical, and the right staff, to business success. And what I would say to you is if you're looking for something to read on getting the people piece right, Good to Great by Jim Collins is very much worth a read. I just wanted to contrast quickly two businesses, one that didn't have the right staff and one that certainly had much closer to the right staff. The first was a laundromat. They came to see me, the husband and wife, who were directors of the company, and they said, "Paul, we want to place this company into liquidation." I spent some time with them trying to understand what the financial position was, and I understood that they had underpaid their staff by a small amount. I did an assessment of the assets and liabilities of the business with them, and I ultimately said to them, you do not need to place this company into liquidation. What you need to do is go back, talk to your employees, get some time to pay them. And I was talking a few months, and I sent them away to go and talk to the staff. Now, what I hadn't appreciated is this husband and wife director had bred a them and us culture in the business. They didn't ever speak to the employees other than to reprimand them. The relationship between the directors and the staff was terrible at best. And so when they went to the staff and said, look, we need some time, we've underpaid you by this amount of money, the staff actually called Fair Work, they called the tax office, and asked for the company to be investigated, and ultimately said they weren't prepared to provide time. So husband and wife came back to me the following week, and we did actually liquidate the company, which to me, it's not work that I like to do because I think it should have been avoided. I contrast that with a second example, an example of a client we've been doing more recently. It's a builder. Now, the relationship between the directors and the staff in this organisation was fantastic. The directors had done everything they can to develop the staff. They always kept the staff in the loop. They were always talking to them about what was happening in the business. And ultimately, probably about 6 months ago, they had a problem. Their problem was a project that they had expected to start, which was 15 residential homes, was cancelled just before it was about to start, and the builder had geared up for it, so it gave them some cash flow issues and some solvency issues. They came to us and said, look, we need to fix our solvency issues, and we said, look, you know, we could possibly restructure the business by voluntary administration. One of the major issues is the number of employees by number were the largest number of creditors. So when you look at it, the majority of creditors by number was the employees. So any attempt to restructure that business needed the support of the employees. Directors decided they wanted to put up a proposal for a deed of company arrangement, so it was a deal with the creditors, and it required the support of the employees. We weren't sure how it would work, but ultimately the employees were faced with a decision. Do we liquidate this company and the fair employment guarantee would kick in and they would then have their entitlements within 2 to 3 months, or were they prepared to wait 3 to 4 years as was required under the deed of company arrangement? And unanimously, the employees supported the restructure of this business, despite the fact that they could have got their money much earlier and more certain had they voted to liquidate the company. So I think it goes to show that the right staff can actually make or break a business. And if you're looking for stuff on leadership to read, John Maxwell, all of John's work is very high quality, and certainly all of it that I've read. The other one is some of Patrick Lencioni's work. He's written The Ideal Team Player, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, amongst others. And he has some really fascinating stuff. Now, I realised that because we started late, I'm fast running out of time. So I will now move to the final quadrant, which is financial matters. And I believe that this quadrant is underpinned by all the others. Finance, I believe, takes care of itself if you have everything else right. But the clients still need to be vigilant around cash flow, financial planning and budgeting. Budgets and plans seem to be a mystery in the world of the SMEs that we deal with. We do still see clients that don't succeed because of lack of financial planning and budgeting. And just a short example, I was doing a liquidation of a company that ultimately did a property development. Now, what we had, the director was a restaurateur. He decided he wanted to do a 47-lot property development. He approached a local project manager. They did some literally back of the envelope calculations where they worked out the estimated realisable value of this project finished was about $8 million. The land itself had cost about $1 million. With other costs, the profit was estimated at about $3 million. So it was a project that was worth doing. The director went to the bank, asked the bank for a funding facility, and he had a funding facility tied to the pre-sale on lots. Ultimately, what he hadn't appreciated was how long it would take to sell those lots. So he never factored that in, and I've tongue-in-cheek said back of the envelope calculations, because that was exactly what they were. Was no better than that. And ultimately, we finished up, because the bank facility wasn't enough, the company was unable to pay the contractors, and we finished up being appointed probably a week before a winding up petition was due to be heard by one of the subcontractors on the job. And that was purely because the cash flow hadn't been matched to the likely expenses. So really, when you look at that, there should well have been a significant surplus out of that job had the funding been matched appropriately. And I do believe that cash is king. Cash flow is absolutely critical to any business. Profit's nice, but cash flow is critical. And there's certainly a difference for the non-accountants between cash flow and profit. Lack of cash flow kills some good businesses. But when you think about it, a good business in tough times negotiates longer time to pay their suppliers while requiring faster payment from its customers. They might offer the customers some discount to pay quicker. They manage more closely their inventory. They might even think about factoring. And I can certainly see reasons why you would use a factoring facility for a business that's growing. A good business will have monthly cash budgets. They'll understand their costs and the cost drivers. Market price is not enough. And whenever I'm talking about market price, I always think about the first job I ever did once I was registered as a liquidator. It was a small residential builder. I sat down with the director because I was trying to understand why there was such a large deficiency in the company. And we actually went back and looked at the last project, which was a house that he'd built and sold. And I did the calculations with him on sale price. We ultimately looked at the costs of the building, you know, what he'd paid suppliers, what he'd paid subcontractors, and the last project he'd made a loss out of. There was no doubt there was a loss in it. So I went back to the one before. I then went back to the one before that. So we actually went back about 3 years, and every single job he had made a loss out of. And ultimately, when I pushed him on how he had set his pricing, he said, look, the guy down the road was charging that. The thing was, the guy down the road was a bulk builder. He was doing average quality builds. This guy was doing a high quality build and hadn't differentiated his product, and as a result was making losses. Somebody was picking up some bargains in very good quality houses for very reasonable prices at the time. But I come back to the point that knowing your market price is not enough. You've got to understand your costs and your cost drivers. Now, ultimately, there's a myriad of reasons why established business fails. They're not always something that could be fixed by the analysis of the profit and loss in the balance sheet. You've got to get the people piece right, the marketing and the systems right, and keep an eye on the financial aspects. And my own view is professional advisors should seek to not only understand the financials of their clients, but also understand the client's business holistically. Challenge the clients to make small incremental changes to the way they work, and to appreciate that small changes in people, systems, or marketing can have a profound effect on the financial side of their business. And despite our business having existed and survived for over 40 years from the financial problems of some of your clients, we do nonetheless want to see the majority of your clients do well and flourish. Now, I'm well aware that I've gone over time, and I'm very grateful for your time, and I apologise for the technology issues that we had earlier. I won't take questions now, but please, if you do have questions, put them in the chat box, and I will come back to you in relation to any of the questions you might have. So thank you very much for your time today. I very much appreciate you attending, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks very much.